The topic of the next discussion is the rise of 4K camera for live production. And we have on the stage Klaus Weber, Senior Product Marketing Manager Camera at Grass Valley. And Gisbert Hochgürtel, Product Manager Professional Solutions Sony Europe. And Jan Fröhlich, he's actually a PhD student at Stuttgart Media University and color scientist at Dolby Laboratories. Moderated, the discussion will be by Rainer Kamper, CTO at Broadcast Solutions. So please go ahead.
Hello and welcome to our 4K camera panel. In the previous panel, we heard that 4K would be a driving force into IP, which for my understanding was very new for me, that 4K with high data rate would be an introduction to IP. So, to give you a short overview what 4K in live production means, we have a handout on the tables which show you the evolution of SDI standards and the mapping modes, how pixels are mapped into an SDI stream or later an IP stream. It shows some meanings and definitions of UHD, ultra high definition, resolution of cameras, and payloads and data rates. So please use this handout. We don't want to go too deep in some technical details, but it will help you to understand some terms and definitions. IP and 4K are the most talked topics in broadcast industry. The display industry, like the Korean display industry, Samsung, LG, and others, they are selling 4K panels in your local media market at a lower price than a standard HD panel. But we have no content. And how to create content? In the beginning, we need the glass, the lens, and then the camera. And we have here on our panel two of the main manufacturers. They're specialists, Klaus Weber and Gisbert Hochgürtel, and I'd like them to introduce their approach and their technology in 4K camera. Klaus, please.
Okay. Well, it was so that for many, many years, live production cameras always was based on the same type of technology. They was all based on 3 imaging devices, 2/3 inch. Many, many years ago, there was an SD resolution. They was replaced by HD images. And it was a relatively static, let's say, technology which was used. It was all based on CCD images for many, many years. And it's just recently that the imaging technology have improved in a way that CMOS images became more and more an option in the beginning. But I think it's fair to say today that CMOS images have completely replaced CCDs as high-end images in nearly all applications. So what we see now with a change from standard high definition to 1080 progressive, but also to 4K or even further, the things is not so clear anymore. So you find, if you look around in the market, all the different type of solutions. You find 2/3 inch CMOS images up-converted. You find 4 imager cameras, you find single imager cameras, single imager with a large size, with a different lens mount. You find single images in a medium size with an optical conversion to 2/3 inch. So any type of combination, basically, you can find. There's a reason for that, because UHD is so demanding to the imaging technology that you need to accept compromises. So if you don't care about the compromises, so you have different, or no, let's take it the other way around. You have to make compromises, and because of that, you find the different solutions. So each solution has its strengths, but also its limitations. So, and it will be interesting to see how the technology will develop in the next couple of years. So if we will come back to that situation that all the high-end live production cameras will look basically the same. I think nobody can predict that yet, but at least for the time being, we have different solutions. Each have its strengths, each have its limitations, and I think they need to be carefully selected, that the best solution is used for the specific application. And there are many applications around and many different challenges.
Gisbert, I think Sony had a different approach and different models in the past and perhaps in the future.
Well, I mean, Klaus has already pointed out that there are different types of how a 4K signal can be generated in the camera. All the different manufacturers have found different approaches, and the Sony approach is a two-folded approach. We have two types of cameras. On the one side, we have the BMW F55, which is a single sensor camera, CMOS, with a super 35mm image size. So that is a camera which is made for live production, where you use where you want to give a filmic look to your pictures, where you need a large sensor, where you want to benefit from the shallow depths of field. That is the one side of the approach, and the other side is a traditional CMOS camera with three sensors on a prism block. And each sensor has native 4K resolution, and so you can have a camera for the, what shall I say, standard live application like sport and all live production applications which you usually have today with your 2/3-inch HD camera.
Besides the challenges in the sensor, what challenges do we have to cope with in production? Is pulling a focus in 4K? Will it challenge even the best cameraman? Is sensitivity an issue? Do we need more light? What about noise with the sensors? Perhaps.
Yeah, you basically mentioned all the different challenges, and therefore there is not one solution available which can cope with all the challenges at the same time. It's impossible. So because some of the requirements are just in the opposite direction. So sensitivity is a challenge, because if you put more pixels on the same image size, you will have smaller pixels, and smaller pixels will automatically be less sensitive, will have less dynamic range, and will request more light to generate the same amount of charge. That's not always possible. So in especially live applications where the shooting conditions are not predictable and not controllable, that is one of the real challenges. And there's more to that. Sometimes there might be enough light that you can close, for example, your iris to a position where the depth of field is in an acceptable range, like you have a shot outside on a sunny day. There's no problem to achieve an F number of F8, for example. It gives you a decent depth of field. But with F8, you will not be able to receive 4K images from the lens. And that's an optical limitation, or a physical optical limitation, cause of diffraction effects, which you cannot compensate. There's nothing. Diffraction is an effect which does not depend on an HD or a 4K lens. It's a physical limitation. So it means if you take all that into account, you will find out that depending on the application, different solutions might be the best compromise. And as said, there are many different solutions available on the market, and for a good reason.
If we look to standard production right now, an OB-Van company perhaps will use 4K camera mode in 10% of their production and 90% doing a normal HD production. Are there any restrictions in an HD production with a 4K camera?
Well, we believe that with a proper 4K camera, you can serve both directions, the HD and also the 4K direction. And in particular, as let's say our 4K camera has the same sensitivity than the HD camera we have, there is no such limitation in regard or in terms of light. But you benefit from the 4K sensor because you have another frequency response curve, so that whenever you have an HD output from the 4K camera, you can be very sure that you have a high quality picture which you get out of your 4K camera, high quality HD picture, which does not require any detail enhancement anymore because the picture is sharp from its origin. Because the frequency response of the sensor is, of course, different to that of an HD sensor. That would be one advantage of it.
Klaus, do you agree?
No, not fully at least. So there is always a compromise. So if you operate a camera in native 4K, it will have a lower sensitivity if the same technology is used. And of course, if you compare an old CCD camera with an out-of-date technology compared to the latest CMOS technology, it's true, you might be able to compensate a difference in sensitivity, but of course, nobody stops you to use the latest CMOS technology also for an HD camera, and then there is a difference of at least one f-stop or even two. So, and in addition, and that's one of the of the compromises I mentioned, if you go to the small, tiny native 4K pixels on 2/3 inch, you will need to accept that you cannot get a global shutter behavior any longer, which for many, many years was available in broadcast and always have been used as the main argument why CMOS cannot be accepted for high-end applications is the rolling shutter behavior. So in terms of native 4K cameras, you will get automatically, at least in 2/3 inch, I have to say today, you will get rolling shutter behavior. So that's a compromise. And rolling shutter will be there also when you use it in SD, or not sorry, SD, in HD, not in 4K.
It is true what Klaus says. If you do not change or if you do not adopt the CMOS technology for your 4K sensor. But you know, there is, you are right, if you take more pixels on the same sensor size, then of course each pixel is smaller. That is the area, but there is also a certain depth in the sensor, in the device, and if you increase this again, then you can handle the same dynamic range as you can handle with, for example, a 2/3 inch sensor. And I mean, as a matter of fact, our HDC 4300 has a sensitivity at 2000 lux with exactly the same or even 1/3 f-stop more sensitivity than we have today with the HD camera. So I mean, I cannot understand the argument of sensitivity. It is the same. And if you come to the matter of diffraction, that is right. The more pixels you have, the smaller is each pixel. That means it has a certain impact on diffraction. But up to f8.0, I can guarantee that there is no decrease in MTF. You cannot measure it. And beyond f8, it starts to decline. But to be honest, if you work with a 2/3 inch HD camera today, you should not use an f-stop smaller than f8 anyway. So I don't think that that is a big limitation. You're smiling? No?
Yeah, okay. I don't want to, I think we shouldn't use that one as a ping pong thing. You have a different point of view, I understand that, understandable, but I cannot agree on that one, but I don't need to, so please.
Okay, we talked about the sensor size, which is the same as we used before, 2/3. But on the other end of the glass, that's the LCD or OLED panel on the consumer side. And there is the question, does size matter? The 4K consumer experience will require at least 65 inches in order to easily notice a difference. And you adopt it in your normal living room. So you have to cope with the size of your living room and with your partner, wife or man, whatever. They have to agree on having a panel like this in that room. So my point of view is that Ultra HD or 4K is not addressing the complete set of tools which we have. And therefore, I would like to ask Jan to introduce us with HDR and wider gamut.
So, a lot of people asking, what is HDR? What is the limit? Is 100 to 1? I learned at school that standard TV has a dynamic range of 100 to 1. So is anything beyond that high dynamic range, or is it beyond the 1,000 to 1 in cinemas? And then there's also another question. A lot of broadcasters ask me, should we do HDR or shouldn't we? And actually my point of view is it's already there. So you can buy an 800 nit TV for less than 700 euro. And you can, if you're a broadcaster, you can master in a dim environment at 100 nits. But this TV will anyway display it at 800 nits. You can't do anything against it. And I personally measured an LCD panel where I was of a mobile device, and I was really surprised because I thought LCD panels are kind of limited to a dynamic range of 1 to 1,000, but it was 1 to 4,000. And actually, I measured a couple of times and I verified that it was 1 to 4,000. So this is well beyond the dynamic range we know. And some viewers will watch a standard definition or a high definition but standard dynamic range program that was mastered for something like 100 to 1 to 500 dynamic range on this device, and it will kind of stretch the images. So the first thing, the kind of call to action is HDR is already there. The question is only, do we want to be in control of it if we start adopting it? Or do we just master a standard dynamic range program and then the consumer manufacturers create their devices who do whatever with the signal and stretch it to some high dynamic range? So, but that's my very, very personal opinion. So for me, it's not the question if we need to discuss about HDR. It's already in there. We need to somehow care about, like, I remember when we came from CRTs, we didn't really care about some noise in the blacks because you couldn't see it. And then on some LCDs with the elevated black 16 mils suddenly looked really, really bad. And we needed to care about this. And it's kind of the same with HDR. The screens, the displays are getting better and better. And we need to have our strategy how to cope with that and how to make our images look best.
So do you think that HDR and wider gamut has a significant greater effort on the picture than resolution, or goes it both together?
It's an interesting question, because 2 years ago, especially if you would have asked me personally as Jan, not in a position of a company, but just speaking for myself, I would have said it's the better pixel that I prefer, because I was blown away by the HDR displays, and especially if you combine it with wide gamut. But to be honest, I had never seen HDR and 4K together. So I had only seen HDR in HD, and then I had seen 4K with a standard dynamic range. And about 1 year ago, for the first time in my life, I saw HDR together with 4K. And suddenly I knew why I like 4K. Because in a lot of images, depending on the viewing distance, it's hard for me to even see a difference in 4K, because most of the structures you can't have the resolution. But then I had this beautiful image, and it was some mountains, and there was snow on top, and you had all these small specular highlights on the snow. And in HD, it didn't have the resolution to show these small speckles and these specular highlights on the snow. But with 4K, suddenly the material appearance, or 4K combined with HDR, the material appearance was amazing. And I stepped back, and I stepped much further back than ITU says that the distance you need to really see a difference. And I was so sure that I saw a difference if they're these really 4K pixel specular highlights or the HD pixels. So for me, the answer is, if there's no kind of cost to it, if I could just wish what I love to have, then please give me both.
Okay. But you have to build cameras for that.
Yes. Yeah, it's a good question. We believe that it's not only having more pixels. More pixels is fine, but at the end of the day, it's always a matter of viewing distance. Yeah? And if you are too far away from your display, you won't see a difference if it is 4K, HD, SD. It all looks the same if you are too far away. So you know the good or the recommended viewing distance to a 4K monitor is about 1 times the picture height. So it's just a rough value, 1 times the picture height. And then it doesn't matter if it is a 30-inch, a 40-inch, a 60-inch, it's just a matter of viewing distance. So I would like to say that especially in homes where there is not so much space between TV screen and the couch where you are sitting on, I think 4K makes sense because you are sitting anyway maybe 2 or 3 meters away from your display, and with a 4K display you can see then more resolution. That is one point. But I think we also have to see there are much more indicators for picture quality than just resolution. We have resolution, okay, temporal resolution, but we also have frame rates. And we all know that with higher frame rates, your picture impression, especially for movement, and that is what we are doing, we are making moving pictures, not still images. So moving pictures get better if you increase your frame rate. The downside is increasing the frame rate is automatically increasing the data rate, and that is something which is critical with 4K anyway. And then we also have another aspect to take into account, and that is color gamut. Color gamut is something which is very important for picture quality. And if we talk about HD, we are talking about ITU 709, which is very, very limited in terms of comparing it to the human eye, what you can really see. So that is a very big limitation, and if we could remove it, just BT 2020, for instance, we could give a much better picture without increasing data rate. It's just a wider color gamut, and there is high dynamic range, I agree to that, but here I would like to separate it a little bit from the production and from the viewing side. We know on the production side, for a long time we have cameras which can reproduce or capture a wide dynamic range. That is not so difficult. The difficulty is to bring it to the end user at home. And here, in my view, the limitation factor is the gamma curve, which comes from the old CRT times. You know, a camera has a 0.45 gamma, and the CRT has 2.4 gamma, and if you multiply it, you come to gamma 1.0, which is the desired effect. But today we are not talking about CRT monitors anymore. We are talking about modern displays, OLED display or modern LCD displays. So we are able to reproduce much more dynamic range, but we are still limited by the ITU recommendation for the gamma curve 0.45. And that is exactly where I think the technology from Dolby and what you are doing, what we are doing in our cameras are taking impact in the case that we take another form of the gamma curve so that we can reproduce much more dynamic range. But it is not so new to camera technology. Klaus?
In general, I agree with all the things what I've said, but your question was basically what is more important. And if I would need to make a choice, then for me it's clear the biggest improvement or the biggest impact in the perceived image quality is HDR, at least to my point of view. It's bigger than 4K, it's bigger than extended color gamut. But of course, in an ideal world, we want to have all. Yeah. And I have of course, there's no doubt, 4K high frame rate means 100 frames per second, HDR, color gamut 2020 or even further, perfect. If you then take in account that, as said, the biggest improvement is high dynamic range, and high dynamic range basically does not request a lot of extra data. it's maybe a headroom of 20% or so. It depends how you transmit, how you produce. Maybe if you go to 1080 progressive, it will be double frame rate of today or data rate of today. So it's still moderate improvement, and the perceived quality would be dramatically better. So if you go to 4K, as we know, it's 8 times the data rate of today's HD. If you go to double frame rate, it's 16 times the data rate of today. If you combine it with 20% more for high dynamic range, and then, so the question is that really, let's say, practically possible? No doubt about, in terms of the ideal system, it would have all together. But I think, again, also customers need to make a choice, which option to put. And I think, of course, there can be a certain flexibility in what you select, but you have to also, at one point of time, you have to say, look, this is what I want to transmit. And I think, again, this is not our choice. We, as a manufacturer, we deliver the tools. We deliver tools for high dynamic range, for extended color gamut, also for 4K. That's not a question. And we are more than happy to sell the most feature-rich camera because it's the most expensive one. So it's good for us. But at the end, I think there must be a business model behind.
And so,
I absolutely agree. And interestingly, so the point where my university got really well known in the industry was when in 2013 we took 2 high-end cameras with 14 stops of dynamic range. We put it into a mirror rig like you normally use for stereo shoots, but we used it with a disparity of 0. And we offsetted one camera. Actually, we used the mirror that transmitted 98% and reflected 2 to 3%. And so we got an offset between the cameras of 4 stops. So we ask ourselves, do we need even more dynamic range than 14 stops? And the surprising answer, and it's hard for me to say because actually this footage is near everybody in the industry licensed it, we are famous for it, but actually it was really hard to find scenes with more than 14 stops. And like if you buy a really modern, like a current generation 2015 camera, then even on prototype displays that could display 20,000 nits to 0 nits, we were quite happy with images of one camera, of one 14-stop camera. So in the end, current generation cameras are not the limit. I was surprised that all the infrastructure is not the limit. So if you have a full 10-bit infrastructure like SDI, you can transmit HDR signals. You need to use a different EOTF, something like SMPTE 2080-40 is, for example, the choice in Blu-ray disc, and for a lot of camera, it started being the output. So the infrastructure is also mostly there. There might be with some effects devices also where you need new, but the cabling, the transmitters, it's all there. So the biggest problem, in my point of view, the biggest challenge is monitors, because you want to see your signal. You can't transmit something without seeing it. And HDR monitors, especially beyond 1,000 nits or with really a large size and high 4K resolution, that's really tough. I'm not aware of one. If you know such a monitor, tell me.
The size is a limiting factor in that case, yeah.
Last week there was a panel in London, and we heard from some early adopters that they face problems with HDR signals on standard monitors, with artifacts. Is there any kind of backwards compatibility with HDR, wider gamut?
So I think there are 2 possible approaches. The one possible approach, or there are 2 approaches that are most famous. The one is, if you're a broadcaster, you produce an HDR, but at the output of your TV station, you produce a standard dynamic range signal, and you broadcast this backwards compatible, for example, in H.264 to receivers that can receive it today, and then you send it's sometimes called enhancement layer, so a second stream that only the HDR TVs can read, and this adds the information that is needed to show an HDR signal. So the cool thing about this approach is that you don't need to change anything about legacy, and that you are in control how the standard dynamic range signal looks like the full image. And the other approach, it's sometimes called HDR10, is to say we anyway have to step to HEVC, or we want to step to HEVC encoding. And if we anyway step to a new compression codec, then anyway the set-top boxes for the consumers need to be replaced. So then let's don't have this dual layer approach, but just send one signal, one HDR signal, because if the set-top box anyway needs to replace, then we can also down map this high dynamic range signal to a standard dynamic range signal at the consumer side. And we can send some kind of metadata, because the problem is this down mapping, you can't fully automatically do it. So for example, for a soccer game, most of the times I want to see all the details. So I would like to tone map a little bit more, perhaps also use some spatial tone mapping. For a movie where the story is told with light, I will probably like to have more contrasts and tone map little bit less. Or just select the window. Sometimes more the bright areas, sometimes the darker areas. So there's this dual layer approach, and then there's the one single layer approach. That's somehow the two approaches that I'm aware of.
I heard from NHK and BBC, they have developed a hybrid log gamma curve together. And at least NHK has already standardized it as an ARIB 67 standard. And this gamma curve is a compatible curve. It is for HDR monitors who can understand the gamma curve. They show a perfect picture. And the normal monitors, which are not HDR capable, they are capable of showing a very good picture quality. So you can serve both worlds. Probably that is a way, or Dolby has a way of a closed system where you have an encoder and decoder for the gamma curve. So there are some costs involved, which is maybe not preferred by the customers. So there are several, what shall I say, systems existing today on the market, on the horizon, in the test phase, and we will see what will happen. Our approach is that we have a special S-Log3 gamma curve, and that after having the program recorded or the program done, it is then transferred, for instance, to a hybrid log gamma curve for transmission.
S-Log means Sony log.
Sony log, yes.
Is there a G-Log as well?
Okay, I want to say something to that. Of course,
okay.
This is a very good example about compromises. So the ones you told is the ideal scenarios, and I fully support that one. And I think if we go to a next generation transmission format, we should aim for the best and not for something good enough. And I think the hybrid log gamma is a system where the upper half of the gamma curve is replaced by logarithmic translation. It looks in the first moment quite interesting, but on the other hand, you get a compromised SDR quality and you get a compromised HDR quality. So you are not getting the best of both worlds. And I'm not sure, first of all, will the market accept an SDR quality which is less quality than today? Just to make it compatible to an HDR signal, I have my doubts if that is the right way to go. Anyway, it's not up to us, again, as a hardware manufacturer to decide what the market wants. We deliver what the market wants. Our system today has already the 70-20-84 as a standard curve. It's a software option in our cameras. And we will implement HLG whenever the standard is ready. And by the way, the standard is not really ready because it has been standardized, but only for noise-free signal sources. So it will not work with a camera because it has a far too high initial gain in the bottom end. So if you put a camera signal to it, it will look completely disturbed. So it has been proposed by the BBC or offered that they will put an attention or an addition to the standard at a later stage. They are working on that. But before that is done, we cannot implement it in our cameras. We will do it, very likely. But from my personal perspective, I think it's not the best. And I think that's not what we are should aim for. We should look for the best what's possible and not for a reasonable compromise.
So I can absolutely agree with the university hat on with our footage. We tested the different curves, and we found out that we were not happy neither with the standard dynamic range quality, nor with the high dynamic range quality. So it's kind of logical. Like the perfect backwards compatible curve is the original 709 curve, and you can't just stretch the highlights somehow magically. And the more you compromise on standard dynamic range, the better the high dynamic range gets. But it's always a compromise. And like a single lookup table, it kind of can't work. Actually, there was an amazing amount of research in the 90s by Greg Ward, and then you know the Reinhardt tone mapping algorithms. They first tried use a fixed curve, like the BBC NHK approach. They found out it doesn't work. Then they said, okay, perhaps we can analyze the image and we can do some histogram approaches, because if the image is very dark, make it brighter for tone mapping, for SDR displays. If it's very bright, make it darker, and so on. They found out it doesn't work. You can't just deliver the image quality, at least that I or my DOP wants, with like an automatic analysis, even if it's a flexible parametrized curve. And then they found out, like the tone mapping operators of the late 90s, they suddenly have something that is, for example, called key. So this is a manual, you could call it trim, metadata, wherever, where somebody tells the image, this should look like this. So it's kind of the creative control. And I strongly believe that if we move towards HDR, something like this is needed. And it is not a per scene thing, like the soccer example. For most soccer games, it helps just to say what we care about is the soccer player and having the local detail. And we don't care about that the full contrast is exactly transmitted. So like a soccer game should typically, on a low dynamic range display, it should kind of be compressed. But for a movie, there should be a window, most of the times, that is scene by scene. So that's my experience from the last years and what I read in the 90s literature.
What I understand is that cameras are ready, camera manufacturers are ready to proceed in any way how standardization moves, but the other end, the LCD or the monitor is not ready.
Yeah, and not exactly true. What we have learned, televisions today already offer a larger dynamic range as it is used. In general, it is opposite nowadays. If you look back 20, 30 years ago, it was actually the broadcast industry which was really driving the development. I mean, Eureka 95 or the Muse standard in Japan, it was already ready on the broadcast production side even before the first HD capable TV set was at home and the transmission was not there and so on. But nowadays it's different. A good example is 3D. I mean, 3D televisions was already widely distributed before we even could deliver the complete service, except some test productions and so on. And as we know, by now, it's already gone. I mean, all the televisions today have 3D capabilities. Hardly anybody uses them anymore. There's no transmission, no production, at least not for broadcast. And now we see it also UHD televisions. I mean, we have in any shop you can find half of the televisions in the major shops are UHD. And how many UHD transmission we have today in Germany? But close to zero. So it means now it's opposite. For HDR might be a little different. We theoretically could deliver it now. Maybe we are in line, but HDR displays are coming, even real HDR displays.
That's absolutely true. You can buy the consumer HDR displays, but you can't buy a large size professional display. And this is crazy. When I started in the industry, CRTs, I was amazed by the quality of the professional CRTs. They were so much better than the CRTs at home. But nowadays, it's really hard to get a professional display for HDR that has the capabilities of consumer HDR displays.
At least they are quite expensive. No?
Absolutely.
That is right.
Klaus, you mentioned 3D. We had 3D before. We were putting the hardware chicken before the software egg in that days. And just a joke beside, Jan mentioned the 3D rig they used for this HDR test. This was one of our leftovers. So it was the only time within the last 3 years when it was used, and I was overwhelmed of the picture quality as well. And I think they are free accessible, and you can see it, and it was really overwhelming. But it was the last use case for our 3D rig.
But with 4K, it is definitely different because 4K panels are widely available, and I guess, or I would like to predict that maybe in 1 or 2 years' time you can only buy ultra high definition panels and no more full HD panels. And then we have to take into account that let's say the normal user at home, he has a digital camera, be it a still or a video camera, and with this camera he can really shoot wonderful full 4K pictures. I mean, if you have a 4K picture at home, a 4K monitor, I have it, and if you look at your still pictures on this monitor, everybody is blown away and says, I have never seen pictures in this quality. And there are video cameras already on the market in 4K. They are not that expensive. They are in a normal range, and you can make your own 4K program. So I believe it is something we should not underestimate, this effect coming from the consumer side.
And you don't need glasses.
Yeah, of course. Yes, that is 3D. I saw it from the beginning. But you know, there are always these 3D waves in the history of film and television. So we survived another wave.
So I think we are quite sure 4K will proceed with additions, HDR, wider gamut. Standardization has to move on, and infrastructure has to be developed. We are limited to these 4 cables right now. We heard IP would be the solution. I am not so sure within the next days or years. So what are your lookings into the glass bowl?
Yeah, I think I agree on the mid to long term 4K is the next standard, but I only believe into UHD, let's say not in 4K to be precise, in the so-called phase 2 from the DVB definition. So it has to include HDR and white color gamut, otherwise it will not work, it will not fly. On the other hand, I think this will not be really available for wide employment in the next 12 months or so. I think it will take a little longer. And also in the infrastructure, I kind of agree with the topic or the discussions going on about IP. I think for a full deployment, not just as a small island, you will need to have a single wire connectivity. And I don't see an in-between standard like a single wire 12 gig or so. I think that will be a dead end. So we need a new technology, which IP is, but again, realistically, 12 gig per camera, or maybe even 24 gig per camera with all the resources you need, I don't think it's 12 months, even not 24 months. For real wide, let's say, availability, it takes a little longer. So maybe first islands in the next 12 to 24 months, yes, but for real wide availability, it takes a little longer.
Thank you for that very clear view and figures in months. So any questions in the audience? No? Then thank you very much for this very nice discussion and information. And we have some 4K cameras over there, and the gentleman will be there and help you with any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.